This episode of Noon features Michael, a U.S. Air Force veteran and retired police sergeant. After enduring a post-traumatic stress injury, including an officer-involved shooting, Michael bravely shares his journey of resilience and recovery. Tune in as we explore Michael's impactful story and the crucial importance of addressing mental health challenges amongst first responders. Let's get started. All right, Michael, thank you so much for joining us on the Noon podcast today. How are you doing?
Doing great. How about you?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you so much. Can I go ahead and get an introduction?
Absolutely. It's a very long story, so I'm going to make it as short as I can. But I'm originally from the San Francisco Bay Area in California, born and raised. I come from a law enforcement family, and my interest in law enforcement actually started as a child. And in college, I majored in criminal justice, had a full scholarship through the Air Force, and I went straight in as a commissioned officer, as a second lieutenant, into the United States Air Force. I was security forces, which is basically law enforcement, anti-terrorism, force protection, air-based ground defense, foreign airfield assessments, nuclear security, a whole bunch of things. I served 6.5 years active duty. I served in the Middle East, South America, all over Europe, all over the United States. I got out honorably in 2004 as a captain, and I moved back here to the San Francisco Bay Area. I went straight into civilian law enforcement for the Walnut Creek Police Department, which is about 20 minutes outside of San Francisco. I served a total of 14 years as a patrol officer, field training officer, driver, training instructor. I was a detective. Also undercover 2 years for a California State Drug Task Force. So basically like the state version of the DEA for California. Was promoted to sergeant, was running patrol teams on the street, and eventually was also a PIO, public information officer. And my story today really starts with a very traumatic incident that happened as a brand new sergeant back in 2012, the end of 2012. And that incident really just changed my path. It changed everything. I planned on having a full career in law enforcement, but unfortunately I had to medically retire in 2018 due to post-traumatic stress injury, what I like to call it, versus disorder. And now I'm really on a mission of smashing the stigma around mental health. And so I speak all across the country to military people, to all first responders, firefighters, paramedics, dispatchers, police officers, about the realities of the trauma, the things that we see and have to endure, and those effects not only on us, but on our family. And unfortunately, I almost lost my own life to myself. I got that dark and that low, but I want to show people that I'm living proof that no matter how bad it gets, no matter how dark it seems, you can get better. It's not easy. It takes a lot of work, but you can get better and come out the other side of this.
It's great that you're able to do that and you're able to continue to share, those feelings and share your stories.
Well, it's, for me, I really think it's a calling. I've always had a calling, whether it be law enforcement, the military. And honestly, when I retired, I could have just gone away, lived a quiet retirement life with my daughter. But I really a lot of things happened actually, and it started with a single podcast interview. I never planned on sharing my story. I never envisioned writing a book. I never envisioned public speaking, but I truly believe that all of this happened for a reason, and it gives me that purpose. It gives me reason to get up every single day and make a difference.
So how did that single podcast interview affect what happened today?
So it's a great story. So I medically retired in the summer of 2018. And at that time, I was always big on social media, not sharing my personal story, but being an advocate around mental health and suicide prevention, suicide awareness. And so I've always had a big following on LinkedIn. And this gentleman, his name was Danny Bird. I didn't know him, but it turns out he was a former police officer that lived about 2.5 hours south of me, also in California. And he was big into fitness. I'm into fitness. And he ran a podcast at the time called Iron Crew Athletics. And he just sent me a message on LinkedIn and said, "Hey, I love the work that you're doing. I used to be a police officer, and I really would like to talk to you about your journey and your advocacy." And I said, "Hey, I really appreciate the offer, but it's not really something I'm into. Like, I don't feel comfortable." And fortunately, this guy, I want to say he harassed me in a good way, but he kept, hitting me up, and he got me to the point where he's like, "Look, I will drive the 2.5 hours to you. You just name the spot. I just need an hour of your time, and we can make this happen." And so he got me to commit, and I'm that kind of guy where once I commit, I'm not backing out. And so he did drive up, and this was about a year after I retired, so 2019, and we met at a Mimi's Cafe. It's funny because when you listen, it's on video and there's audio, but you can actually hear like the elevator music that's playing in the Mimi's Cafe, like slightly in the background. And I remember I walked in the back of this cafe. Again, I never met him. We had like literally like two phone conversations. And I go back there thinking, oh, we're going to get some good breakfast, have some coffee. I was like starving, get to know each other. And I walk back in the back. He's got two computers in this little cubicle, or this booth, I should say. He's got headphones set out, a video camera, and he says, "Hey, I'm really sorry, but I've got to get out of here in an hour. I've got to head back down to the South Bay. So we got to jump into this." And so we did, and he literally just started asking me questions, and I didn't think about the answers as far as let me be worried about what I say or how this comes out. I literally just answered everything straight from the heart. And that's how I operate today. That's what I do when I do public speaking, when I do the book. Everything I do is just complete transparency, complete vulnerability, because I think that's the only way to truly reach people. And so we record it. And afterwards, I'm not going to lie, I was very anxious. I was worried because at this point, I was still ashamed and embarrassed about my journey through post-traumatic stress injury. And even most of my coworkers had no idea the things I'd been through. They had no idea why I medically retired. They thought it was for another health or medical reason. And so I was really worried about, people sending me messages and looking down upon me as being weak, unfit for the job. And that didn't happen. It got aired, and actually I started getting messages from all over the world, from UK, from Australia, from England, all over the US, on how, you know, parts of my story was really their story and how it resonated with them. And then they started sharing their personal stories with me. I mean, literally complete strangers. And this is really where, every time I spoke, I felt this just burden coming off my shoulders. And my family of people who truly got it just really started to expand. And I realized how many of my brothers and sisters out there were just suffering in silence. And so that podcast literally led to podcast after podcast after podcast. And I think for the first, I want to say, year and a half, I didn't even seek out a single podcast. I would just get request after request after request. And, I started doing them in New Zealand, Australia, the UK, Canada. I mean, literally everywhere. And so that led to public speaking, which then eventually led to this book, this best-selling book with my co-author, Dr. Shauna Springer. And it's just, again, I think it all happened for a reason. Everything just seemed to fall into place.
That's amazing. That is an amazing story. And what a really cool way to essentially be born into what you're doing now. Um, what do you think was on your LinkedIn profile that caused him to reach out to you?
Well, I don't know if it was anything specific on my profile. I would say at the time it was probably the volume of the posting that I was doing, because I would be posting definitely every day, sometimes multiple times a day. And really, I was focused on the suicide epidemic among all first responders and military members. And after meeting this gentleman, I later realized that he had been through, like all of us, some very, very traumatic incidents. And I really think that, he also had some healing that not only he had done, but that he still needed to do. And so I think really it was also giving him the strength and courage to carry on with his fight through this post traumatic stress injury.
I would probably, I mean, without knowing him, I would agree with that. I will say, in all of the first responders and the healthcare professionals that I've interviewed in the last almost year, cops are the hardest to get on here. You know what I mean? I do think that the stigma is almost worse for cops than it is for most other, first responders or healthcare professionals. Why do you think that is?
There's a few reasons, but I will tell you you're spot on. And I'll tell you the proof and evidence of that is the suicide numbers. The suicide numbers are high for all first responders, but definitely for law enforcement, it's much higher than paramedics, firefighters, dispatchers. And I think part of that is it's the stigma, it's the culture. It starts in the police academy. It starts that, we're trained to be these big badasses that have to go out there and confront the worst of the worst. When people call 911, they're calling us on the worst days of their lives. And the situations that we have to go into are usually when they're happening, not after they've ended or they've calmed down, but things like active shooter situations, domestic violence, disturbances, bar brawls, horrific car accidents. I mean, you name it, we're usually the first on scene. And I think, and it's wrong. I mean, it's not correct, but the culture has been and the training has been that showing any kind of emotion, any kind of feelings is considered weakness. It's considered vulnerability. And I learned very on, and I talk about this in my book, this phenomenon, but when I was in the field training program, I was taught right away about gallows humor. And that's where when we went to these horrific incidents, and I talk about some really, I mean, horrific ones, my very first 2 weeks, and my training officer would joke about them afterwards. We never really addressed the humanity of how horrible they were. And a couple years later, I became a field training officer, and I did the same thing. I carried on that same tradition of, what, we're going to detach ourselves from this stuff. Nothing's going to bother us. We're impenetrable. We're these superheroes where nothing's going to touch us. Nothing's going to take us out. And in reality, each one of these incidents, it's stacking up inside of us. And I equate it to like a jar. When we start our careers, there's a little bit of things in there from our childhood and from our life growing up. And then we start going to call after call after call. And if we're not talking about it, if we're not decompressing, if we're not just getting this stuff off our chest and shoulders, it's going to build up. And it's going to get to the point like it did with me, where it was 8 years into my civilian law enforcement career. And I had this very horrific incident. It was a fatal officer involved shooting. And that incident was my tipping point. It wasn't just the shooting, but it was the hundreds of traumatic incidents before that that I never dealt with or never talked about. And, I even see it today. I travel all over the country, and depending where I go, some places are more progressive than others, but I still talk to people all the time that reach out. And when they ask for help, they're put on an island, they're outcasted, they're shunned. Nobody wants to be associated with them. They treat them like they've got some contagious disease or cancers or something that's, they're going to catch if they get too close to you. And so that's why I do the work I do, because we have to change the culture. If we want to save lives, if we want to help stop the suicide epidemic, we have to normalize being able to have trusted conversations with our quote unquote red family, blue family, whatever the case may be. That's what we need. That's what's going to change this.
And how do you think that we can start integrating that into our companies as policies?
I think it's very easy. It's actually doesn't cost anything, and I don't even think that it has to be a policy. But what we need is we need leaders at all levels. So let me just use a police department example. So if you're an officer that's been on for more than a year, you're a leader because there's brand new officers coming in all the time. If you're a corporal, if you're a field training officer, a sergeant, a lieutenant, a commander, a captain, a chief, all these levels, we need these people to be open, honest, and vulnerable themselves, to set that example, to set that standard. I'll give you a perfect example. When I first started speaking, I went to a police department here in the Bay Area, and I talked to one of the lieutenants, and I later found out that they had it was before I went there and spoke, but like a year earlier, they had a department-wide kind of like peer support training for everybody. And this lieutenant, it wasn't planned, it wasn't announced, but he decided to open up and share about some previous struggles that he had been through, really dark, deep personal struggles, and how he came through that, what resources he used, how he came out the other side. And no one knew this. Like the chief might have known, but beyond that, his peers, his subordinates, none of these people knew that he had suffered through all of these things in both his work life and his personal life because we're so good at putting up this front, where nobody knows what's going on. But my point to this is that can you imagine the power of that? If you're a brand new police officer or if you're a brand new firefighter and you see one of the most senior ranking people in your company or your agency, and they're literally in front of you sharing something so deep, dark, and personal with you, that's going to give you the strength, the courage, the trust, most importantly, to know that if that time ever comes with you, I can seek out that person and have a one-on-one conversation with them and know that they're going to get it, know that they're going to understand it and that they're not going to judge me. And like I said, this costs no money. We can do this right now, today. People listening to this interview, you can go to work tonight and you can do this yourself. You can be that example and you can see how this spreads and how soon people will be more comfortable doing the same. That's how we change this culture.
Yeah, I agree. And the culture does need to change. I don't think that there's any question about that. I do, however, feel like we are seeing more culture change in the last probably year or two, even post COVID, that's allowing people to open up and share more of their feelings.
We do, but I have to tell you, there's so much more work to be done. And, what I think is very, I'll just say horrible and shameful is that there's a lot of agency chiefs out there who don't believe in post-traumatic stress injury, who think that people are faking it. They don't want this talked about in their agencies. They don't want people like me coming and sharing their stories of survival, their stories of hope, because they're worried that, people are going to not show up to work. They're going to go out on injury. And it's like, when are we going to stop treating our people like a commodity and treat them like family, treat them like people, and treat them as our number one resource? And that's the sad reality. So, yeah, I'll agree with you that things are changing, but I also tell you that so much more work needs to be done.
Oh, I agree. Is the that poor attitude something that you notice more in smaller departments versus bigger departments or vice versa?
Actually, I don't think there's any rhyme or reason to the size of the department because I've gone to some very small departments and they are so advanced and so progressive, and it's because they have a phenomenal chief and a phenomenal leader. I'm going to dime him out right now, but Chief Elliot Moya out in Maine, one of the most inspirational, honest, vulnerable chiefs I've ever met. He has a very small department, but he is touching, changing lives. I mean, across the entire state, across the United States. And he puts on conferences every year where he brings people in to speak about this stuff. But I've also gone to very big agencies where you can't even get your foot in the door. Like nobody wants to open this door and talk about this subject. So again, I think it comes down to the leadership of the agency. That's what matters. It doesn't matter about the size. But I will tell you that in just my personal experience, being on the West Coast, the East Coast, and the Midwest, I feel like the Midwest is kind of a little bit behind. And I really think that's where the efforts need to be stepped up.
I would agree with that. I think that there's a lot of macho feelings still here, which is unfortunate. How do you feel that your own injury was recepted when you decided to leave?
It's a great question. So initially, my agency was very supportive, got me all the resources I needed. I was on a path of recovery. But then when it wasn't quick enough, it wasn't fast enough. This is where what I call admin betrayal, administrative betrayal, or institutional betrayal comes into place. And Doc Springer and I talk about this extensively in our book, Relentless Courage. And I found this is the number one topic that is resonating most with all first responders because what I'm finding is that, we all go to these horrific traumatic incidents and they do take a toll, don't get me wrong. But what I'm finding is the thing that pushes people over the edge the most into either thinking about suicide or actually committing suicide is when their agencies turn their back on them. And in my case, my agency turned their back on me. And I realized that I was just a number filling a position, that all those years of hard work and dedication were literally meaningless. They either wanted me back right now or they didn't want me at all. And that was a harsh reality to come to terms with because I was a hard charger. My career was off the charts. I mean, literally everything was aligned. I wanted to be chief of police someday. I was leading every single team I was on in arrests and tickets and stops. I mean, every category you could imagine, I gave my all to that place. But when it came down to it, none of that mattered. It just didn't. And that's the sad reality. And again, that's what I'm finding. And it's not talked about. I mean, there's not a lot of people out there speaking about it. There's not a lot of books about it. But administrative betrayal, institutional betrayal, I think, in my humble opinion, that is the number one issue that is leading to suicide among our first responders.
And what would you say the time frame was between when you felt supported to when it was dropped altogether, to the time you had that betrayal?
I can tell you exactly. So I asked for help initially. It was on the anniversary of my shooting in 2016. So it was December 27th, 2016. Right away, I started seeing a culturally competent clinician. I started going to first responder support meetings. I found about this program called the West Coast Post Trauma Retreat. I'm a volunteer peer there now, but I went through as a client. I went through there in May. And when I went through there in May, it was life changing, life saving. I mean, it really made a positive difference. But it was a couple weeks after that, which is where the admin betrayal came into place. That's really where it started. So for me, I would put it about 5.5 months time frame is where it happened for me.
And in those 5.5 months, were you working at all?
No, I made the decision to be completely off of work. Interestingly enough, when I first asked for help, a couple things. The first thing was one of my administrators kind of tried to talk me out of it and said, maybe we can give you a couple of days off. Maybe go talk to our contracted therapist. And the problem for me is that if that would have happened, 4 years earlier, that probably would have helped. But for me, I had been suffering in silence for 4 years, and it got to the point where I was trying to get killed on duty. I endured a 4-year federal lawsuit. I lost my marriage. I started getting repeated skin cancer diagnoses. I lost my stepfather, who was my hero. He was the one in law enforcement. Everything in my life started falling apart. And so I knew that when I finally got that strength and courage to ask for help, and I'll tell you, I was ashamed and embarrassed when that happened. I know now that was strength and courage, but at the time, I was so ashamed and embarrassed. But the reason I asked for help, and it's in the book, but one of my best friends tried to kill himself when I was on duty. And that was my wake-up call because all I could think about was my daughter and what was going to happen to her if I ended up dying on duty like that. And so I knew that I had to go full into this. Like I had to jump fully in and devote all my time and resources into me and to getting better. So I made that decision myself.
And what was your tipping point?
As far as what in asking for help or the admin
Mm-hmm.
betrayal?
In asking for help.
Well, the tipping point was the suicide that happened. So I was on duty, and so my federal trial ended September 2016. So my shooting happened, do the math, end of December 2012. This federal trial, and we saved lives. We actually saved the lives of a couple. There was a guy with a butcher knife trying to kill them. He then tried to kill me and my fellow officers. And unfortunately, I had to take his life to save their lives. But his family sued us immediately for $15 million. And depositions and proceedings drug on for 4 years. Well, I ended up a defendant in San Francisco for 2 weeks on trial at the height of the anti-law enforcement movement when I first started. And we ended up prevailing. We actually won the trial. But that November, so about a month and a half after the trial ended, and at this point, I'm literally like trying to get killed on duty. I was on duty as the day shift sergeant, and a call comes out, suicide in progress. Turns out it's my best friend's house. He's a Vietnam veteran. He was a 35-year reserve officer with my department. He retired a few years earlier. I had no idea that he was struggling or suffering like he was. And I got to the hospital just as the ambulance brought him in covered in blood. I mean, literally, he had slit both wrists, stabbed himself in the torso multiple times, OD'd on a bunch of medications, and he was in and out of consciousness. And I looked at him and said, "You're going to pull through this. You're going to make it." And they rushed him off to emergency surgery. And I was sitting there in the hospital for hours with his sister who had driven up, people from the department, and all I could feel was this overwhelming guilt as to why I didn't see the signs, why I didn't prevent this or stop this from happening. And then all I could think about, my daughter at the time was only 6.5 years old. And I'm going through this contentious divorce, this nightmare divorce. And all I could think about was my daughter's not going to have any idea who I was, how much I loved her, and what's going to be the domino effect on her future children if she ever finds out that I died by suicide. And so thank God my friend survived. He actually has his own chapter in our book. But a month after that, on the anniversary of my shooting, so December 27, 2016, I literally broke down in my car for 2 hours. And that's when I finally got the strength and courage to pull out my cell phone. And I called the on duty watch commander and just said, "I can't do this anymore. I need help." And that phone call saved my life.
So, what changed for you after you made that phone call?
Well, the first thing that happened was I met a phenomenal, culturally competent clinician, one who truly understands us, one who truly gets it. And on our very first meeting, she told me about a very tragic incident that happened to her decades earlier before she became a therapist. And so at that point, I knew I could trust her with my life. I mean, she was living proof that, I mean, her incident was more horrific than anything I could ever imagine. And the fact that she made it through that and that she was living proof that life does get better, that was key to my recovery. But also, she told me about these first responder support meetings. I'd never heard of them, but they have them all over the US. They're not affiliated with any agency, they're run by volunteers. Many people have been through the West Coast Post Trauma Retreat, which has locations all over the US. It's not just the West Coast now, but they run these volunteer discussion meetings. You know, they're one day a week, they're an hour long, they're anonymous, only first names are used. It's for addicts, alcoholics, people like me who are JFU. We say just fucked up. It's a saying. And literally, that's where I realized that I wasn't alone. You know, I realized I had all these brothers and sisters, you know, who are cops, firefighters, paramedics, dispatchers, who are going through the same things, who had the same impacts on their health, on their families. And really, those two things, and I did a lot of other things in my recovery, but I would say that those two things were the foundation and were absolutely critical to my recovery. And it was all about being able to share finally in a trusted environment to get these demons, you know, off my chest, and to know that I truly wasn't alone, to know that I could call up or text these people, you know, these people that were strangers a couple meetings earlier who now literally are some of my closest friends. Because I mean, imagine like sharing everything with these people and knowing that they have your back to the fullest and that they're there for you 24/7.
That's awesome. And it's something I've never heard of before, so I'm going to have to look into that. You've said it a couple of times, though, that your clinician was culturally competent. How important was that for you in your time of need?
It's critical. I've heard so many stories, you know, in my volunteer work and my speaking, how many people reach out through their EAP programs. They get a random, you know, marriage family therapist or some social worker who has no idea, who has no experience, no background working with military members or first responders, and it's a disaster. Usually, what happens is the first responder goes to one single meeting, they start to try to open up, it backfires. Their therapist ends up getting traumatized and literally shutting them down. They then decide that they're never going to go back to therapy again because it's such a horrible experience. And so it's critical. And people listening to this or watching it, you have to go to a culturally competent clinician or therapist, because we are very unique. The things that we have to see and endure over our careers, the impacts on our families is like nothing else. And we need people who truly understand it. And that's the only way we're going to heal. That's the only way we're going to be able to have that trust to where we know we can share anything with these people and that they're going to actually get it and understand it. It's not going to be something they just read about in a textbook.
And was that somebody your work provided for you, or did you do the research to find that person?
So I was very fortunate. I actually there was four officers involved in my shooting, and one of the officers had seen her years earlier and really praised her, and so she recommended her to me. And because of that recommendation, I said, you know what, I can trust this because here's my fellow officer, my sister who went through the same incident I did, and she found this person who helped her. And so for me, that was a big deal. Having that validity, that confirmation that this person's good to go. It's like, okay, I was like, I'm in good hands here. But then when that therapist opened up and shared that personal story, it just sealed the deal for me.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So just changing gears a little bit. You've been out of the service now for a few years. What would you say that you miss the most?
There's a lot of things I miss. I won't lie, I miss the adrenaline. I miss the excitement. I was a hard charger. I was a go-getter, and I really liked catching the bad guys. I really liked stopping criminals. But I didn't like seeing destroyed lives. I didn't like seeing all the trauma out there and the horrible things that we had to endure. But there's a sense of making a difference, and I would call it touching people's lives. And I definitely still do that today, just in a different way. But part of it too, just the unknown. Every day was different. You never knew what was going to be coming that next call, and it was just, for me, it's all I knew. It's what I wanted to do since being a child, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, there was a lot of negatives to the job, but I thoroughly enjoyed being a police officer.
That's awesome. And what would you say has been your proudest moment?
Honestly, asking for help. Um, I think by doing that, I'm showing other people that they can do it, and it's ironic because when I first went off duty, I cut ties with everybody in my agency, and I think I just outcasted myself. I mean, I think some people outcasted me, but I think I outcasted myself. But a year or two after I retired, I've actually had several people from my old agency who have reached out to me on a personal level and have told me how I inspired them to get help or to seek help. And they shared kind of with me things they were going through, things I had no idea about. And I truly look at that as saving lives. I know we save lives as first responders out there on the street, strangers, but to save the lives of people that we know, um, that there's nothing like it. And so for me, I think that's my proudest moment. It was my toughest moment. And again, the ironic thing is I was so ashamed and embarrassed of it when I first did that. And it literally took years until I was able to actually be proud of that moment.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that's a great mind shift for you as well. I mean, it is such a huge stigma. We shouldn't be afraid to ask for help, and we shouldn't be afraid of losing our jobs, or even like the thought of losing our jobs when we're asking for help.
Exactly. And here's the thing, and this is why I always keep saying post-traumatic stress injury because instead of disorder, because the word disorder has a very negative connotation to it. And I know that's the medical term, it's what's in the DSM, that's what psychologists and psychiatrists use. I get that. But the thing is, and especially as first responders, that single word disorder has a very, very negative connotation. And it makes people feel like it's something they're stuck with, it's something they can't get rid of, they have no control of it, they just have to live with it. And it's a proven fact by medical doctors with brain imaging, brain scans, that exposure to trauma, especially repeated exposure to trauma, it causes both a physical and a chemical change in the human brain. It's an undisputed fact. And the thing is, how many first responders, whether you're a firefighter, cop, paramedic, how many of us get bad knees, bad shoulders, bad backs? And, we suck it up for a while, but eventually we get to the point where we say, I just can't take this pain anymore. I've got to go to see a doctor. Maybe they give you some pain meds, some injections, physical therapy. Maybe you have to have surgery, then more PT. My point to this is there's a road to recovery. Now, with that knee, that back, and that shoulder, it's never going to be the same as it was before that injury, but it can improve and it can get better. It's the same thing with post-traumatic stress injury, but I can also say you're not going to ever be the same person you were before you started this career because this career changes you. But I will tell you is that you can get better from post-traumatic stress injury. And I think now today, I'm actually a much better person than I was when I was actually working. I look at the world totally different now. I'm not so judgmental. I'm not so black and white. Like I literally appreciate things. I'm grateful every single day to be here. And that's the thing is that we've got to change our mindset around this and let people know that, hey, if you can go get help for a back injury or knee injury, why can't you go get help for a brain injury?
No, it's true. We should be allowing people to have those days off, and especially like we need to be able to do it without the fear of people leaving and not coming back. You know what I mean? Because if you have somebody who's been in the service for a year or 2 years, we should be having them see somebody to help take care of those issues so they don't become chronic long-term issues, right? Speaking for the EMS side, this is a stepping stone for a lot of people. It's okay, I saw it, now I'm moving up. I'm going to go become a nurse or a doctor or a PA, or maybe I'm going to get out of medicine altogether because I can't handle this. I think if we got to a point where, like you said, if we can get past that stigma and we can get people the help they need in the beginning, then we can, produce fruitful careers for people.
Not only that, I mean, I would argue that you're going to actually be a better nurse, a better doctor, a better firefighter, a better police officer. Because I know if I was still working today, I would be a much better police officer, a much better supervisor than I was back then. Because I get it, I understand it, I've been through it. And that's the thing, it changes your perception. This experience will change you as a person. And I think it changes you for the better. And so, but then when you outcast people and you get rid of people, they're not changing for the better, they're suffering.
Yeah.
And now they're turning to drugs and alcohol and all these negative coping mechanisms, and their life is falling apart and losing everything. But if we wrap our arms around these people and show that we're invested in them, that they are family and that we care about them, that they are a priority, in the end, they're going to be that much more productive. They're going to be that much more beneficial. They're going to make our agencies that much more stronger.
Yeah, I agree 100%. So I want to give you the opportunity to talk about your book, and then if you have a website or anything like that, or anything that you want to talk about that we didn't get a chance to talk about.
Absolutely. The book, it's amazing, but I have to tell you how this all started. There's a story behind it. So my co-author, Dr. Shauna Springer, phenomenal, phenomenal person. She is a clinical psychologist, a Harvard graduate. She spent most of her career working with the Veterans Affairs, working with combat veterans, and also with Tragedy Assistance Program for survivors and first responders. And so she's culturally competent. She gets it. I didn't know her. She actually, again, LinkedIn is a powerful thing.
Yeah,
But
I'm learning that.
yes, right before COVID happened, she reached out to me on a fluke. And it turns out that she lived in the city I worked in as a police officer, but we never met. Our paths never crossed. In fact, she didn't know about my shooting. She didn't know about any of my incidents. But again, she saw the work I was doing on LinkedIn. And by this point, I'm speaking, I'm doing podcast interviews, and she just wanted to connect to kind of see what I'm doing and to have her let me know what she's doing. And so we set up a phone call, and she tells me about her work with stellate ganglion block, which is a medical procedure to treat just the physical symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And we talk about it in the book. I actually ended up getting the procedure done. But then she asked about my story. And so I tell her my story, my deep, dark personal story. And afterwards, she just asked me, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I kind of laughed and I said, well, I kind of briefly thought about this. I said, but the 20 plus years of report writing, I'm just like, I'm burnt out on writing. I don't have the concentration, the focus, the motivation that I once did because of post-traumatic stress. And I don't think I get a project like that done. So we leave the conversation at that. A couple weeks later, she hits me back up and she's like, look, Michael, and she'd already written 3 books at this point. She said, your story is really, it's sitting with me. And, she's like, I've heard hundreds and hundreds of trauma stories, but your story is going to help save countless lives. And she said, and we haven't met each other. This is only our second phone call. She says, I want to do this book with you. I want to make this book happen. And without even meeting her, I knew in my heart it was right. And I said, let's do this. And COVID happened. And literally, for the first almost year, we didn't even meet in person. We did everything via Zoom. We did 2-hour Zoom meetings every single week to work on this project. But what makes our book so unique, and I'm going to tell you right now, as far as I know, there's not a single book like this out there in the world. And the book is called Relentless Courage, Winning the Battle Against Frontline Trauma. And this book is for everybody. It's not just for first responders, nurses, doctors, military people, their families. It's for everybody. It shows the human side, the true human side behind the badge and behind the uniform. And the thing is, what makes it so unique is that every chapter has 2 parts. The first part is my story told in my voice, all the way back to childhood until present day. But the second half of every chapter, Doc Springer comes in, breaks everything down in layman's terms, and literally shows the impact on us, on our family members, on our loved ones. And together we show a path to healing, a path to recovery. And in the back of the book, we have a whole resource section on vetted resources. Many that are free and confidential. And so the book came out, the Audible came out later, but the actual book came out in April 2022 in paperback, Kindle, hardcover. It's on Amazon. It's now on Walmart.com, BarnesandNoble.com, but it has been a bestseller for 34 weeks. It's a #1 international bestseller in Canada and the US, but we decided to do the Audible. The Audible just came out in July. We recorded it in our own voices, straight from our heart and soul. I mean, it is powerful. And since coming out, it was a #1 bestseller for 14 weeks. And this book is literally saving lives all over the world. It's saving relationships, it's saving careers, but it's saving lives. So I highly encourage you to check it out. I guarantee you will not be able to put it down. And if you do read it, I want to personally hear from you. That's what I'm asking. I'm asking you to reach out. I'm on every social media platform you can imagine. I'm on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, X, TikTok, you name it. Just type in Sergeant Michael Sugrue, Sugrue. I check my messages daily, and I promise you, I will get back to you, but I want to hear your thoughts.
That's fantastic. I'm going to have to pick it up.
It'll blow your mind. I'm going to tell you right now, you do, and we're going to do a second interview because it is going to blow you away. And I will commit to doing a second interview because you will have like 200 questions that you're going to want to ask me. Guarantee it.
Awesome. Well, I will work on getting that this week then. I'm excited. Do
Awesome.
You have a website?
I don't. I just use the social media sites. I'm not that fancy.
Yeah.
I'm pretty low key. I get the messages through all the social media. LinkedIn's probably the best though. If you want to reach out about a speaking engagement, because I do travel all over the US, I am hoping to go international. So if people like in Australia or Canada or UK are listening, hey, I'm down. But send me a message on LinkedIn and I'll definitely get back to you.
I will tell you that Canada is my second highest listening platform. So good luck.
Well, that's the thing. And the book, honestly, here's the other cool thing. So, and I just went on Amazon again today, but the book, the paperback version, is the #2 most gifted book in Canada on suicide. The
That's
number
really
2
cool.
most gifted book. And so there's huge support in Canada for this book, but they got to get me out there. You guys got to bring me to Canada. Let's talk in person and let's make this happen.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Michael, so much. I appreciate that you came out and we had this awesome conversation today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, no problem. I hope you have a good day, bud.
You too. Talk to you soon.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Before we wrap up, we have a few important announcements to share with you. Firstly, we're excited to announce the launch of our brand new 911 Nonsense Facebook group page. It's a community where everyone can go to connect, share ideas, discuss topics from the show, and get all of the most recent updates about the podcast. We'd love to have you join us and be part of the conversation. Next, we want to ask you to rate and review our podcast on your preferred platform. Your feedback means the world to us and helps us reach a wider audience. By rating and reviewing the show, you'll be supporting us in a big way and helping others discover 911 nonsense. If you enjoy what we do and would like to support the podcast even further, we have a few options available. You can visit samspursuit.com to find the links to our 911 Nonsense merch page and our recently released Noon gear page. Every contribution, no matter the size, goes a long way in helping us continue to better the podcast. We know that not everyone is comfortable being on the podcast, but we still want to hear your stories and experiences. If you have a compelling story and would like to share it to be read by me in a future episode, please reach out to us via email at 911nonsense@gmail.com or through our website's contact section. If you choose to be anonymous, we'll make sure to respect your privacy while sharing your story in a way that resonates with our audience. Thank you again for tuning in. We truly appreciate your support and look forward to bringing you more engaging content in the future. See you next week.